Number 10. The Battle of the Persian Gate, winter of 330 BC. This is the moment when Alexander the Great, the man who had shattered every army the ancient world sent against him, stood in a cold mountain pass in modern Iran and realized he had walked into a trap, he had crossed the Zagros, he had massacred the Usians, he had left his general Parmenion to take the safe road, because Alexander did not take safe roads. Alexander took the fast one, and 100 kilometers northeast of what is today the Iranian city of Yasuj, the fast one narrowed into a gorge so tight the Macedonian phalanx could not deploy. Just walls of rock and a whisper of a river between them and a Persian satrap named Ariobarzanes waiting on the heights. Ariobarzanes had lost at Gaugamela. He had watched Darius III flee. He had watched the Persian Empire, the empire that had ruled from the Aegean to the Indus for 2 centuries, crumble in 3 catastrophic battles. What he had not done was surrender. He gathered what he could, perhaps 700 cavalry, perhaps 2,000 infantry. Ancient sources disagree, and modern scholars still argue. What is not disputed is that he took those men into the Persian Gate and prepared an ambush that would give his king one final chance to raise a new army in the east. When Alexander's column entered the pass, they saw movement on the ridges above them. They kept marching, then the boulders came, then the arrows, then the javelins. The Macedonians could not climb the cliffs. Their formations broke apart on the narrow floor of the gorge. Men were crushed by rocks the size of ox carts, punched clean off the trail by stones falling from 100 meters overhead. Alexander pulled back. He pulled back. That sentence had almost never been true before in the campaign. It was true now. For 30 days, Ariobarzanes held. 30 days is longer than Thermopylae. 30 days is longer than most sieges in the ancient world. The winter cold sank into Macedonian bones. Supplies ran short. Alexander sent scouts to find another way, and eventually, either from captured prisoners of war or from a local shepherd whose name history is forgotten, he found one. A goat path. A knife of stone across the mountainside. Alexander split his force, sent Ptolemy and Perdiccas around the back, and led his elite contingent up the shepherd's trail himself in the dark. Dawn broke, and Ariobarzanes woke up to find the Macedonians above him and behind him. The pincer closed. The Persians who tried to break out east were driven back into the killing ground. The Persians who held the pass were butchered from 3 sides at once. Ariobarzanes did not surrender. Ancient sources describe him fighting his way clear, with a fragment of his cavalry, riding for Persepolis to warn the treasury, only to find the city's governor, Tiridates, had already opened the gates to Alexander. Refused entry into his own capital, Ariobarzanes turned his horse around and with the last of his men charged Alexander's approaching army. He died on the plain outside Persepolis, cut down within sight of the palace he had failed to save. His army died with him. It is called the Persian Thermopylae because ancient historians could think of no other battle to compare it to. And unlike Leonidas, who bought Athens the time to evacuate, Ariobarzanes bought nothing. The Persian Empire ended anyway. But 30 days is 30 days, and a man who dies charging is not a man who surrendered. Number 9. The Siege of Masada, Judea, 73 amps. 3 years earlier, the Roman legions of Titus had cracked open Jerusalem, torn down the Second Temple, and dragged the survivors of the Great Revolt back to Roman chains. The last free Jews in Judea were a splinter of zealots called the Saragarhi, and they were on a rock, not a metaphor. An actual rock. A mesa in the Judean desert 400 meters above the western shore of the Dead Sea, with cliffs on every side, a fortress at the top built decades earlier by Herod the Great, and enough grain, oil, and cistern water to feed a small city for years. Around 960 men, women, and children, under the command of Eleazar ben Yair, and out on the desert floor below them, the Roman 10th Legion under Lucius Flavius Silva. Around 8,000 to 15,000 men, camps, ringing the mountain in perfect Roman geometry, a stone circumvallation wall closing every possible escape, and an engineering project that would define Roman military capability for the next 1,000 years. Silva could not climb the cliffs, so he built a ramp made of packed earth, timber, and stone, 200 meters tall at its highest point, angling up the western face of the mountain in a slope that eventually reached 600 meters long. Jewish prisoners of war were forced to haul the material because the Saragarhi would not shoot Jewish laborers. Every day the ramp climbed higher. Every day the defenders on the walls watched it come. There was nowhere to run. There was no Allied army coming. There was no city to evacuate. There was just the rock and the ramp and the sun beating down on the Dead Sea and a countdown measured in wheelbarrows of earth. On April 15th, 73 AD, the ramp reached the walls. The Romans pushed a siege tower up it. A battering ram smashed at the outer stone wall. It cracked. Then it broke. The defenders had already built a second inner wall of wood and packed dirt, softer, designed to absorb the ram instead of shattering. The Romans set it on fire with torches. The wind shifted for one long, terrible moment and blew the flames back into the Roman lines. Then the wind shifted again, and the second wall burned. Silva pulled his men back for the night. He knew the assault would come at dawn. That night, Eleazar ben Yair gathered his people. What he said is preserved only through the Jewish historian Josephus, who was a defector, a collaborator, and possibly a liar. But the story he tells is this. Eleazar told his followers that death by their own hands was better than slavery in Rome, better than watching their wives be raped and their children be sold in Palestinian markets. He gave a speech, and then a second speech when the first one did not convince everyone. Then 10 men were chosen by lot to kill everyone else. Then one man was chosen by lot to kill the other 9. And the last man burned the palace, drove his sword into his own throat, and died. When the Romans came through the wall at first light, they heard nothing. No shouting, no prayers, no war cries, just wind. They found 960 bodies laid out in family groups. Fathers with wives, wives with children, everyone dead, and 2 women and 5 children hidden in a cistern who came out and told them what had happened. Those women told Josephus. Josephus wrote it down. Modern archaeologists have questioned parts of the story. There is not enough physical evidence of a mass suicide at the top of the plateau. Some scholars now think the Romans massacred everyone, and Josephus dressed the killing up as noble self-sacrifice for a Roman audience that would have preferred it that way. But the essential truth remains: the defenders of Masada chose annihilation over Rome. And 2,000 years later, Israeli soldiers still take their oath at the top of that rock in a ceremony that ends with a single sentence. Masada shall not fall again. Number 8. The Battle of Roncesvaux Pass. August 15th, 778 AD. The Pyrenees. Charlemagne, king of the Franks, future emperor of the Romans, the man who would define what Europe meant for the next 400 years, is retreating. His Spanish campaign has failed. Zaragoza would not open its gates. His baggage train is heavy with treasure and gold from lesser cities along the way, and his army is stretched out in a column that has to move single file through mountain passes so narrow the mules scrape their loads on both sides at once. Somewhere in the back of that column, riding rear guard, is a Frankish nobleman named Hroedland, prefect of the Breton March. History would come to know him as Roland. Waiting in the passes above him, watching the treasure disappear into the trees below, are the Basques. Not Saracens, not Muslims, not the pagan enemies the later poem, The Song of Roland, would invent for dramatic reasons. The Basques, Christian mountain people whose villages Charlemagne had probably sacked on the way south, whose walls at Pamplona his army had torn down, and who now saw an emperor's rear guard trapped in terrain they had grown up hunting in. When the ambush hit, it was total. Boulders came down. Arrows came from angles the Franks could not see. The narrow trail became a killing floor. The heavily armored Frankish knights, the paladins whose names would be sung for centuries, could not maneuver. They could not charge. They could not even turn around, because behind them was the baggage train, and behind that was the rest of the army disappearing over the ridge. The Basques did not attack in massed formation. They attacked in swirls, striking, killing, disappearing back into the rocks. And the rear guard was annihilated. Every single man, Roland died there, alongside Egihard the Seneschal, in charge of Charlemagne's household, and Anselm the Palatine Count, and dozens of other nobles whose names appeared in the earliest Frankish chronicle mentioning the battle. The baggage was looted. The Basques vanished into the mountains before Charlemagne could turn his main army around, and by the time he did, there was nothing to fight but corpses. That is the historical battle. What history remembered is different, because 300 years later, an anonymous French poet wrote the Song of Roland. In that poem, Roland fights not Basques, but 400,000 Saracens. In that poem, he has a magical horn called the Oliphant that he refuses to blow out of pride until it is too late, and when he finally blows it, he ruptures his own temples and dies of the wound. In that poem, his sword is Durandal, and when he tries to break it on a rock so the enemy cannot take it, the rock breaks instead. In that poem, angels carry his soul to heaven. It is the founding epic of French literature. The song they sang before Hastings, the story that turned a small rearguard defeat in the Pyrenees into the beating heart of medieval European identity. All because a Frankish nobleman refused to leave his post while the treasure convoy staggered on ahead of him. All because his men died with him instead of running. Charlemagne never led an army into Spain again, but Roland's name outlived his empire. And what kind of last stand becomes so powerful that a lost battle turns into the origin story of an entire civilization? Number 7. The Fall of Constantinople, May 29th, 1453. A city that had stood behind 3 sets of walls for 1,000 years, the last capital of the Roman Empire, the seat of Orthodox Christianity, the crossroads of every trade route from Venice to Beijing. And on the day it fell, its last emperor did something no Roman ruler had done in 1,000 years of imperial history. He took off his purple. Constantine, the 11th Palaiologos, was 49 years old on the morning he died. He had been emperor for 4 years. He had ruled a city surrounded on every side by the Ottoman Sultanate, an empire that had swallowed Anatolia, the Balkans, Greece, Bulgaria, and most of Serbia, leaving Byzantium as a single starving fortress in the middle of a Muslim ocean. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II was 21 years old. He had been on his throne for 2 years, and he had spent every day of those 2 years building the army, the navy, and the cannon he would use to end Rome. The siege had begun on April 6th. For 53 days, the walls of Theodosius, the greatest fortifications in the medieval world, had held. The Ottomans had a super cannon designed by a Hungarian engineer named Orban, a bronze monster that fired stone balls weighing over 500 kilograms, and cracked walls that had turned back Attila, the Rus, the Bulgars, and the Arabs. Even with the super cannon, Constantinople almost held. The defenders were around 7,000, mostly Byzantine militia, with a hardcore of Genoese mercenaries under a soldier named Giovanni Giustiniani. The attackers were somewhere between 50,000 and 80,000, with a fleet blockading the Bosphorus. On the night of May 28th, Constantine gave the last coherent speech of his reign to his commanders inside the Church of Hagia Sophia. He told them the city would fall the next day. He told them there would be no reinforcements. He told them that if any Roman was still alive at sunset, they should die knowing they were the last of an unbroken line reaching back to Augustus. Then he took communion with the Orthodox and the Catholics together in a city that had spent 400 years arguing about whether they were even the same religion. Then he embraced his generals one by one. Then he asked forgiveness of anyone he had ever wronged. And when the Ottoman cannons opened up before dawn, he rode to the St. Romanus Gate, one of the weakest sections of the wall where the fighting would be worst. The gate held for hours. Giustiniani was wounded either by a crossbow bolt or by shrapnel from cannon fire and evacuated to a Genoese ship. His departure broke the morale of the defenders. Then the Ottomans found something worse than a weak wall. A postern gate called the Kirka Porta had been left unlatched or unlatched by defenders who had used it for a sortie earlier in the fighting. Janissaries poured through. The line collapsed. Somewhere in the chaos of the final breach, Constantine XI stopped being an emperor. He tore off the purple regalia that had marked every Roman sovereign since Constantine the Great founded the city in 330 AD. Purple, in Byzantium, was dyed from the glands of a specific sea snail and reserved by law for the imperial family. Removing it was, technically, an act of abdication. Practically, it meant no janissary would recognize him and drag him alive to Mehmed's tent to be paraded through the streets in chains. He drew his sword. He said the words that Greek folk memory has preserved for 600 years, "God forbid that I should live as an emperor without an empire. Since my city is falling, I will fall with it." Then he vanished into the breach. His body was never identified. Legends grew that he had been turned to marble by an angel, and buried inside the walls, waiting to return when Constantinople was Greek again. The reality was simpler and worse. He probably died anonymously in the last moments of the last legion at 49 years old, in a purple that was no longer purple, holding a sword that was no longer imperial, defending a city that had already stopped existing. 1,000 years of Rome ended on that morning, and it ended with an emperor who chose to die as a common soldier so no one could ever say his empire had surrendered. Number 6. The sack of Rome, 1527. The Swiss Guard on the steps of St. Peter's. Here is what you need to know. Every year, on the 6th of May, new recruits to the Pontifical Swiss Guard take their oath in a small ceremony in the courtyard of the Vatican. Every year, they take that oath on the anniversary of the day. In 1527, that 147 of their predecessors died on the stone steps of St. Peter's Basilica in a fight lasting 3 hours against an army of 20,000 mutineers who wanted the Pope's head on a pike. The context was European madness. Emperor Charles V, ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, and Spain was at war with the Papal States. Pope Clement VII had joined the wrong alliance. Charles's armies in Italy, a combined force of Spanish infantry and German Landsknecht mercenaries recently converted to Protestantism and burning with religious hatred of Catholic Rome, had gone unpaid for months. They mutinied. Their commander, the Duke of Bourbon, could not stop them. He could only agree to lead them somewhere they could loot, somewhere with treasure worth the walk. They chose Rome. They arrived under a heavy morning fog on May 6th. The Duke of Bourbon was shot dead at the walls, allegedly by the sculptor Benvenuto Cellini firing a harquebus from an embrasure. But the leaderless army did not stop. They swarmed into the Borgo, the district that stretched from the walls up to St. Peter's itself, and the last thing standing between them and the Pope was a company of 189 Swiss halberdiers. Their commander was Caspar Royst from Zurich. His deputy Hercules Goldley took 42 men and ran with Pope Clement down the Passetto di Borgo, a fortified corridor about 800 meters long, hidden inside what looked like an ordinary wall that connected the Vatican to the Castel Sant'Angelo. It is one of the most famous secret passages in history, and on that morning, it was the only thing keeping a pope from being murdered. The Passetto was Clement's only escape route. Somebody had to hold the front of St. Peter's long enough for him to reach it. Roast and 147 Swiss stayed behind. Halberds against arquebuses. Wool tunics against Landsknecht steel. They formed a defensive circle at the base of the great obelisk in St. Peter's Square, and when the Imperials charged, the Swiss did what Swiss guardsmen had done since the days of Charles the Bold. They stood, halberd blades came down. Spanish infantry piled up in front of them. Landsknechte with two-handed swords called Zweihanders waded into the formation. Hacking through the pole arms, the circle contracted. The circle contracted again. They fell back onto the steps of the basilica itself, fighting on the ground where the tomb of St. Peter is said to lie. Roast was cut down but not killed. Wounded, he crawled to his own house nearby, where his wife tried to hide him. The Imperials followed the blood trail. They dragged him from her arms and killed him in front of her. The last Swiss on the steps died with their halberds in their hands, buying with each additional minute a further step for the Pope inside the Passetto. Clement reached the Castel Sant'Angelo. The 42 guards behind him closed the gates. He would spend the next 7 months as a besieged prisoner watching from the ramparts while the imperial army stabled horses in St. Peter's tortured cardinals for ransom. He faced Renaissance frescoes and killed thousands of Roman civilians in an orgy of violence that shocked even the mercenaries doing it. The Swiss Guard survives to this day because of what those 147 men did on those steps. It is the oldest continuously operating military unit on Earth. It still wears halberds. It still wears the blue and yellow and red uniforms designed in the Renaissance. And every recruit who takes his oath on May 6th is swearing in the presence of the ghosts of 147 men who died at the base of a Roman obelisk in 1527. That he will do the same thing if he ever has to. Number 5. The Siege of Sigetvar, 1566. This is the last stand that killed a sultan. Suleiman the Magnificent had been emperor of the Ottomans for 46 years. He was 72 years old, gout-ridden, riding at the head of an army 100,000 strong on a final campaign to take Vienna and finish what he had started in 1529. Between him and Vienna was a small fortified town in southern Hungary called Sigetvar, held by roughly 2,300 Hungarians and Croatians, under a Croatian count named Nicola IV Zrinski. The Ottoman army outnumbered the defenders more than 40-1. Zrinski was 58 years old. He had fought at the First Siege of Vienna in 1529. He had spent 40 years killing Turks, and he understood with an old soldier's clarity that this siege would be his last. The Ottomans arrived on August 2nd, 1566. They surrounded the town, cut off the water supply, and began a systematic bombardment with 300 cannon. Zrinski had prepared. He had 40 old cannon, 14 new ones sent by Archduke Charles of the Habsburgs, 100,000 liters of wheat gunpowder in the deep cellars of the inner castle, and a garrison that had sworn a personal oath to him rather than to any distant king. The town of Sigetvar was actually 3 separate fortifications connected by causeways over a marsh. The Ottomans took the outer town after weeks of assault, then the inner town. Zrinski withdrew each time to a smaller ring of defenses, drawing the Ottoman army into positions where their cannon could not maneuver. On September 6th, one day before the final assault, Suleiman the Magnificent died in his tent. He was 72 years old, ill, exhausted, and possibly the victim of a heart attack brought on by rage at the fact that Sigetvar still had not fallen. His Grand Vizier, Sokollu Mehmed Pasha, hid the death. He knew the Janissaries would refuse to fight if they learned the Sultan was gone. He kept the tent flap closed, he forged Suleiman's signature, he sent daily reports to Constantinople, written as though the emperor were still alive. The cover-up would last 48 days. It is one of the most remarkable acts of political theater in the history of empire. The final Ottoman assault came at dawn on September 7th. The last of Zrinski's defenders retreated to the innermost keep, a burning tower with the walls collapsing around them. Zrinski gathered his last 600 men. He dressed in his finest clothes, in the noble armor his father had worn with his father's sword and small shield. He ordered the great cannon on the courtyard, loaded with scrap iron, chain, and grape shot. He waited until the Ottoman assault columns crowded into the outer courtyard to receive what they thought was a surrender. Then he ordered the gates thrown open and he fired the cannon into the packed ranks at point-blank range. The scrap iron killed hundreds in a single instant. Zrinski and his remaining men charged out behind the smoke, sword in hand, into the Ottoman army. He was hit by musket fire almost immediately, took 2 wounds, and died with a Janissary's bullet through his head. His corpse was decapitated. His head was sent to the Habsburg Emperor Maximilian II as a gesture of chivalric respect, wrapped in silk. But that was not the end. Deep beneath the burning fortress, Zrinski had left a slow-burning fuse leading to the powder magazine. The Ottoman troops flooding into the empty keep to loot it did not know what was under their feet. Minutes later, the magazine detonated. The blast killed roughly 3,000 more Turks in a single breath. Ottoman casualties for the siege reached somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000, including a huge percentage of the elite Janissary Corps and their sultan. The campaign against Vienna stalled. The Ottomans would not threaten Vienna again for 117 years. Cardinal Richelieu, writing decades later, called Sigetvar the battle that saved Western civilization. He was not wrong. A Croatian count and 2,300 men had bled an empire white, killed a legend, and blown up their own castle on the way out. Number 4, the Battle of Camerone, April 30th, 1863. This is the story that founded the French Foreign Legion's soul. That morning, in a tiny village in the state of Veracruz in Mexico, a French Foreign Legion patrol of 65 men was escorting a supply convoy carrying 3 million francs in gold, munitions, and material for the French siege of Puebla. They were commanded by Captain Jean Danjou, a 35-year-old career officer who had lost his left hand to a musket accident in Algeria and wore a wooden prosthetic hand painted to look like a real one under a white glove. At about 7 in the morning, Mexican cavalry hit them. Roughly 800 mounted lancers under Colonel Francisco de Paula Milan, with infantry columns coming up behind them. Danjou's men were on foot. They had no artillery. They had marched through the night and had not been given a chance to make coffee before the alarm. Danjou pulled his men into a defensive square, drove off the first cavalry charge with rifle volleys, and then made a hard tactical decision. He would not try to fight it out in the open. He would fall back to a walled hacienda. he had seen a mile back called Hacienda Camerone, and hold there until the main French column could relieve him. They reached the hacienda around 9. The walls were 3 meters high. There were 65 of them. Outside, the Mexican force grew hour by hour until eventually somewhere around 2,000 or 3,000 Mexican soldiers surrounded the courtyard. A Mexican officer rode forward under a flag of truce and offered surrender terms. Danjou refused. He walked among his men one by one and made each of them raise their right hand and swear on his wooden left hand that they would fight to the death rather than surrender. Every legionnaire swore. That oath is still remembered. The fight lasted 10 hours. The Mexican infantry stormed the walls repeatedly. Legionnaires shot them down from the roof and windows. The Mexicans set fires to smoke them out. The buildings burned around them. Water ran out. Ammunition ran out. Around noon, Danjou was shot through the chest and killed instantly. Lieutenant Jean Villain took command. He was killed a few hours later. Lieutenant Clement Maudet took over. By late afternoon, Maudet had 12 men left, then 5, then 3. At around 6 in the evening, Maudet gathered his last 3 legionnaires in the ruined courtyard. They still had their rifles. They still had bayonets. And Maudet, wounded, half-blind from smoke, gave the order that has been quoted in the Foreign Legion ever since. Legionnaires, fix bayonets. Legionnaires, charge. The 3 of them, plus Maudet, ran out of the hacienda straight at the Mexican lines. They were shot down in the open. When the last man alive, a Corporal Berg, was surrounded by Mexican infantry preparing to bayonet him, he raised a bloodied hand and shouted that his men would surrender on one condition: that they be allowed to keep their weapons, that they be allowed to escort the body of Captain Danjou back to French lines. The Mexican commander agreed. Reportedly, he said out loud that these were not men, they were demons. The wounded prisoners were treated as heroes on both sides. But Danjou's wooden hand had disappeared in the chaos. It was picked up by a Mexican rancher named Ramirez, who kept it as a souvenir. 2 years later, an Austrian officer serving in Mexico under Maximilian recovered it and returned it to the Legion. Today it is kept in a locked case at the Foreign Legion's headquarters in Aubagne, France. It is the holiest relic the Legion possesses. On April 30th every year, it is paraded through the ranks by a decorated Legion veteran. The recruits watch. The story of Camerone is read aloud in silence. And every legionnaire understands, from the day he enlists to the day he dies, that he serves a unit whose founding truth is that when your captain gives an order to fix bayonets and charge 3,000 men with 3 rifles, you fix bayonets and you charge. Number 3, the Battle of Shiroyama. September 24th, 1877. This is the real ending behind the movie The Last Samurai. Forget Tom Cruise, forget the katana. The truth is uglier, older, and more human. In the years after the Meiji Restoration of 1868, the young Japanese emperor and his modernizers had spent a decade dismantling the samurai class. They banned the wearing of swords in public. They abolished the samurai's tax-supported stipend. They introduced universal conscription, meaning peasants with rifles were now the emperor's soldiers, not hereditary warriors with 900 years of training. For a class that had ruled Japan for 7 centuries, it was extinction by government paperwork. Seigo Takamori was 49 years old, and he had helped to bring this new order into existence. He had been one of the great architects of the Meiji Restoration, one of the 3 most powerful men in Japan by the early 1870s. Then he broke with the government. Over foreign policy, retired to his home domain of Satsuma in southern Kyushu, and became the reluctant figurehead of an uprising by former samurai furious at what modern Japan was doing to them. In February 1877, the Satsuma Rebellion began. Seigo, with about 40,000 men, marched north to overthrow the government. He lost. He lost battle after battle. The imperial army, made up of the peasants he had once looked down on, armed with rifles, artillery, and Gatling guns, tore his forces apart. By September, Seigo's army had shrunk from 40,000 to about 500, then to 400, then to fewer. They had retreated across Kyushu, been hunted through the mountains, and now stood on a hill called Shiroyama, overlooking the city of Kagoshima, where Seigo had grown up. Around them, in a ring of trenches and artillery batteries, General Yamagata Aritomo had 30,000 imperial troops with modern weapons. Yamagata knew Seigo personally. They had been friends. He sent a letter up the hill offering surrender on generous terms. Seigo did not reply. He shredded the letter. Then he sat down with his officers to drink sake in a series of small caves dug into the hillside, and they waited for morning. The Imperial bombardment began before dawn on September 24th. Artillery shells and Gatling gun rounds turned the hillside into a slaughter of stone and shrapnel. When the Imperial infantry advanced, Seigo ordered his last 40 samurai to draw their swords. They came out of the caves in formation. They walked down the hillside in the pale first light, their long swords called katana, raised, and they charged into the volley fire of an army with breech-loading rifles. Seigo was shot early. A bullet ripped through his hip or thigh, either from a Gatling gun or a rifle. The sources disagree. He could not walk. A samurai retainer named Beppu Shinsuke helped him to a spot on the hillside where he could kneel. There. Following the ancient ritual of seppuku, Seigo drew his own short sword and cut his abdomen open. Beppu, standing behind him, brought down his katana in a single stroke and beheaded him to end his suffering. Then Beppu and the last few samurai charged the imperial lines to die in place. They were cut down to a man. Seigo Takamori would be pardoned by the emperor in 1889, 12 years after his death. A statue of him now stands in Ueno Park in Tokyo. He is remembered in Japan not as a rebel, but as a tragic hero, the last true expression of a warrior culture that ended on that hillside. The samurai class was dead. The swords were museum pieces. And the modern Japanese army marched on to build an empire that would burn most of Asia for the next 68 years. Number 2, the Battle of Wizna, September 7th to 10th, 1939, the Polish Thermopylae. The Second World War had begun 6 days earlier when Nazi Germany crossed the Polish border. The Wehrmacht had launched the world's first successful blitzkrieg, and Polish divisions were being cut apart by armored spearheads faster than they could form defensive lines. In the northeast, the German Third Army, under General Heinz Guderian, the theorist and practitioner of tank warfare, who would later burn a path through France, was driving south from East Prussia toward Warsaw. Standing directly in his way was a 9-kilometer strip of Polish fortifications along a river called the Nar, and holding that strip, in a chain of small concrete bunkers, were about 720 Polish soldiers. Some sources say as few as 360. Their commander was a 31-year-old captain named Władysław Radzieniec. Radzieniec had 6 pieces of 76mm artillery, 24 heavy machine guns, 18 light machine guns, 2 anti-tank rifles, and 1 absolute unwillingness to move. Guderian had, according to the numbers historians have been able to reconstruct, around 42,000 men, around 350 tanks, around 657 pieces of artillery, around 189 mortars. He outnumbered Radzieniec by roughly 60 to 1 in men and infinitely to 1 in armor, because the Poles at Wizna did not have a single tank. On September 7th, German aircraft began dropping propaganda leaflets over the Polish positions. The leaflets said that most of Poland was already conquered, that further resistance would only get more Poles killed, that Berlin would treat surrendering troops well. Radzieniec stood on the bunker roof of his command post, a concrete pillbox called Gigi 126, and read one of the leaflets in front of his men. Then he made an oath in front of them. He would not leave his position alive. If the Germans took Wizna, they would take his corpse first. His deputy, Lieutenant Stanislaw Brikalski, swore the same oath. Every officer swore it after them. The German assault began that afternoon. Panzers hit the anti-tank obstacles and were driven back. Infantry attacks against the bunkers were shredded by machine gun fire from carefully placed slit windows. The Poles had ranged their artillery on likely approaches, and the German infantry paid for every meter of ground. On September 8th, Guderian himself arrived at Wizna, furious at the delay. He ordered a Stuka dive bomber attack against the bunkers. The bombs cracked concrete but did not break the defenders. He ordered more panzers up. He ordered more infantry. For 3 days, September 7th through September 10th, roughly 720 Polish conscripts held roughly 42,000 Germans out of a 9-kilometer front. The bunkers were destroyed one at a time. German engineers crawled up to the concrete walls under covering fire and placed satchel charges against the ventilation slits. Bunker by bunker, the defense collapsed. Brikalski was killed on the second day. By the morning of September 10th, Radzieniec had 2 functional bunkers left. All his men were wounded, ammunition was almost gone, Guderian sent a captured Polish officer to the GG-126 command bunker with a demand: surrender immediately, or the Germans would execute every prisoner they had taken. Reginus considered this. He knew his men could not fight much longer. He ordered them to lay down their weapons and surrender to save themselves. Then he did what he had sworn to do on September 7th. He waited until the last of his men had left the bunker. He sat down inside alone. He pulled the pin on a hand grenade, he held it against his chest, and he detonated it. He was 31 years old. His body was found in the ruins of the bunker after the war. Guderian, in his memoirs written many years later, tried to explain why his corps of 42,000 men and 350 tanks had been held up for 3 days by a Polish company. He blamed his engineers. At the Nuremberg trials, when he was asked about Wizna, he called it an inconvenience. The Polish soldiers who had been captured were later moved to prisoner of war camps where the majority survived the war. And the resistance at Wizna, along with dozens of other small Polish stands in September 1939, delayed the German timetable enough that the German air campaign against France in 1940 was launched into weather it had not been designed for. History remembers Wizna as the Polish Thermopylae. And history is right. Number 1. The Battle of Saragarhi, September 12, 1897, the northwest frontier of British India. This is the closer. This is what a last stand can be when it is fought with such total articulate defiance that it enters the vocabulary of an entire people. On a rocky ridge called the Samana in what is today the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province of Pakistan, the British had built a chain of small mud and stone forts to control the passes between the Afghan tribal territories and their own colonial holdings in the Punjab. 2 of these forts, Fort Lockhart and Fort Gulistan, were about 8 kilometers apart on the ridge. Between them, on the highest point of the pass, sat a small signaling station called Saragarhi. Its job was to relay messages via heliograph, a mirror device that could flash Morse code from one fort to the other across the intervening mountains. Saragarhi was manned by 21 soldiers of the 36th Sikhs Regiment of the Bengal Infantry under a senior non-commissioned officer named Havildar Ishar Singh. All 21 were Sikhs, a religious and martial community that had made up a significant portion of the British Indian Army since the 1857 rebellion. They were armed with breech-loading Martini Henry rifles. Around them, the Afghan Afridi and Orakzai tribes had launched a general uprising, part of the broader Pashtun revolt of 1897, and had already tried to storm Fort Gulistan twice. Both attempts had been repulsed. Frustrated, they picked the smaller target. On the morning of September 12, 1897, between 10,000 and 14,000 Afridi and Orakzai tribesmen surrounded Saragarhi. The signaler was a 19-year-old sepoy named Gurmukh Singh. He was younger than most of the men he served with. He flashed a heliograph message to Colonel John Houghton at Fort Lockhart. Under attack. Send help. Houghton flashed back. Cannot come. Path blocked. Hold. That message was the beginning of one of the strangest real-time communications ever transmitted from a losing battle. For the next 7 hours, Gurmukh Singh stood at his heliograph and narrated the death of his own regiment, mirror flash by mirror flash. This many attackers, this many bullets, this man wounded, this man dead. The tribesmen offered safe passage if Havildar Ishar Singh would surrender the post. Ishar Singh refused. The first assault came against the main gate. It was repulsed. The second assault, also repulsed. By noon, one Sikh sepoy was dead and another wounded. Gurmukh Singh flashed the update. Houghton flashed back, telling them to conserve ammunition. There would be no reinforcements. The relief column could not fight through in time. The tribesmen set fire to the scrub around the walls. Smoke concealed their movements. They dug at the base of the wall. Some accounts say a Sikh soldier named Bhagwan Singh made a suicidal sortie from the gate to buy time. Some say Ishar Singh, wounded and bleeding, positioned himself alone at the gate to hold back a rush while his men reloaded. The battle turned into hand-to-hand fighting. Sikhs with fixed bayonets against tribesmen with knives, tulwar sabers, and Jezail muskets, in a small stone box on a mountainside where nobody would arrive to help them. At around 3 in the afternoon, the wall of the signal tower began to give way. Gurmukh Singh sent his final transmission from the tower. It has been preserved in various forms. The essence of it was this: main gate breached. Down to 1. Request permission to dismount and join the fight. Houghton, watching through binoculars from Fort Lockhart, gave permission. Gurmukh Singh disassembled his heliograph. He carefully packed the mirrors into their leather case. He picked up his rifle. He came down out of the signal tower. Witnesses at Fort Lockhart, 8 kilometers away, watching him with binoculars, saw a small figure emerge onto the ground, run into the last knot of Sikh defenders around the door, and then vanish into the tribesmen. His last words were reportedly the Sikh war cry, Jo Bol So Nihal, Sat Shri Akal. He killed, by Sikh regimental tradition, roughly 20 tribesmen before he was cut down, and the signaling tower was set on fire around his body. All 21 defenders of Saragarhi died. Not one surrendered. Estimates of Afridi and Orakzai losses vary between 180 and 600 killed, and many more wounded. The relief column, arriving 2 days later, found the ruined post filled with bodies. The tribesmen had taken so long to storm Saragarhi that they never captured Fort Gulistan. The British reinforcements arrived in time, the passes held, the frontier held, the uprising was crushed. Every one of those 21 men was awarded the Indian Order of Merit, the highest gallantry award for Indian troops. In the British Army at that time, the equivalent of the Victoria Cross for British soldiers. They were awarded posthumously, in a period when posthumous awards were extraordinarily rare. Their names were read aloud in the British Parliament. The site of Saragarhi still stands in modern Pakistan, though the ruins are neglected. But in India, September 12th is Saragarhi Day. Sikh regiments around the world commemorate it every year. The story is taught in schools. The signaler who asked permission to stop transmitting so he could go die with his brothers has become a symbol of every soldier who has ever done the same. And the 21 who fell there rank, in the professional judgment of military historians, as one of the greatest last stands in recorded history. Those are the 10, from a Persian satrap ambushing Alexander the Great in a Zagros mountain pass to a Sikh signaler flashing a mirror message from a burning tower in the Hindu Kush. Different centuries, different weapons, different empires, different gods invoked at the moment of death, but the same essential moment, repeating itself across 2,000 years of human history, the moment when a group of soldiers, cornered, outnumbered, offered a way out, chose instead to die where they stood. Some of them did it for country. Some of them did it for faith. Some of them did it because they had sworn an oath on a wooden hand or on a purple cloak or on a heliograph mirror, and they were not going to be the ones to break it. None of them won their battles. All of them lost. Ariobarzanes died on a plain outside a city that had already surrendered without him. The Sicarii died on a rock the Romans forgot about within a generation. Roland died in a mountain pass so remote that Charlemagne would not turn his army around in time. Constantine XI died in a purple that no longer meant anything, defending a city that had already stopped being an empire. The Swiss Guard died on cathedral steps so the Pope could crawl through a wall. Zrinski died charging out of a burning fortress that would blow up moments after he fell. Danjou died with a wooden hand in a Mexican hacienda. Sego died on a hillside overlooking his own hometown. Reginus died alone in a concrete bunker holding a grenade against his chest. And 21 Sikhs died in a stone box on a mountainside, one of them still holding a rifle he had brought down from a signal tower after asking permission to join the fight. They all lost, and every one of them is remembered. That is what a last stand is. It is not a battle you win. It is a battle you refuse to run from. It is the moment when a soldier decides that being alive on the wrong side of a line is worse than being dead on the right side of it. It is the reason armies still fight when they know they cannot win, and the reason the world still tells these stories 2,000 years after the swords rusted and the bones turned to dust. The 300 Spartans became legend because Herodotus wrote about them. Every last stand on this list became legend because someone, somewhere, refused to let the story die. A woman in a cistern. A monk with a manuscript. A colonel with a pair of binoculars 8 kilometers from a burning tower. Someone always survives to tell it. And as long as somebody tells it, the men who fell there never quite finish falling. If you made it this far, hit the like button. It tells the algorithm to show these stories to more people who want to hear them. Subscribe so you never miss another countdown. And drop a comment. Tell us which of these 10 last stands hit you the hardest. Tell us which one you had never heard of before this video. Tell us where you are watching from, because these stories belong to everybody. Every people has a Thermopylae, every people has a Saragarhi, every people has a corner of a map where their soldiers refuse to run. Thank you for watching. We will see you on the next one.